Eve never committed original sin. She carried out the first archetypal command of the human soul. For millennia, the story of the fall has been told as a tale of disobedience, but that is the lie dogma forced us to swallow. What Paradise truly feared was not rebellion, but the most dangerous act of all, choosing wisdom over blind obedience. And that choice birthed an archetypal guilt so deep that even now it paralyzes humanity, keeping you from reaching your own wholeness. This is a shadow work story. We are not here to read the Bible, but to use Carl Jung's lens to decipher the language of the unconscious. Eve is the mirror of your inner world. She is the archetype of the anima, the intuitive, sacred principle the patriarchy tried to bury in the shadow. Her story is the path to understanding. 1. The collective shadow behind the myth of the fall, the primal fear of the sacred feminine, of Eros. 2. How guilt became the archetypal lie that keeps us from integrating the self, our totality. If your soul is tired of being punished for its own curiosity, if you feel that the price of your truth is isolation, you are standing at the gate of the garden Eve once dared to cross. If you seek the strength that lives in wholeness and feel the call of your own awakening, don't walk this journey alone. Subscribe now to Shadow Work Stories and tap the bell so this work can continue guiding you through your own individuation. Leave your like and let us unravel the mystery of Eve's command, beginning with the true sin, the projection of the collective shadow onto feminine curiosity. When we picture Eden, we imagine peace and perfection. But through Jung's lens, the original Eden is no paradise. It is the archetype of innocence, the state of the psyche before awareness, before awakening. Eve and Adam lived in an unchosen wholeness, a world without shadow, where the only law was obedience and the absence of discernment. In Jungian terms, they lived under the rule of a primitive logos, rigid, rational, terrified of the untamed force of Eros. What ancient dogma punished, and what our society still tries to punish, is not sin, but threat. A threat to order. The power structures of that time needed a scapegoat for everything chaotic, intuitive, and deeply emotional, the sacred feminine. Eve, bearer of that principle, became the perfect target. She embodied the proof that the key to the divine lives inside the inner experience, a living danger to the rule of hierarchical law. Jung taught us that the collective shadow is the vast reservoir of traits, instincts, and powers a society or an entire era refuses to see in itself. It is the unconscious of civilization. In the emerging culture around Eve's story, dogma rejected Eros, the realm of deep feeling, direct connection, and yes, the sacred power of feminine sexuality. Eve, with her spiritual autonomy and emotional depth, embodied the force Logos feared. To protect its collective persona, that facade of order, purity, and rigid hierarchy, the world had to demonize her. The collective shadow, made of misogyny, fear of sexual power, and terror of emotional chaos, was poured onto Eve. This condemnation was never a moral verdict. It was a cold act of psychological survival. By labeling her, society reassured itself with a lie. The danger isn't our repression. The danger is her. They stripped her of dignity. Condemned, Eve was forced to carry the archetypal burden of the repressed sacred feminine. Her fall is, in truth, a metaphor for the pain of every woman whose intuition was called hysteria, whose power was named sin. The world was healing itself at the expense of projecting onto her. That forced projection erased her identity. Eve was reduced to a stereotype, the sinner, the guilty one. A society blinded by its own shadow could not see her as whole, as bearer of totality. It saw only the reflection of its own guilt and repressed desire. For Jung, projection is a defense, the psyche refusing to face its blind spots, handing them to someone outside. In Eve, this mechanism became macro, an entire civilization running from its intuitive, emotional core. By condemning her, they were unknowingly condemning the feminine side of every human psyche. This was Eve's cross, the relentless inner battle between the truth of herself and the lie of her imposed persona. Society stole from her the right to human complexity. Yet the key to Eve's power is hidden in that very conflict. Attacked so fiercely by the collective shadow, she was forced to dive into her own unconscious to find a truth untouched by outside judgment. The separation pushed her inward, toward the totality the world feared. What they sought to punish, her soul was preparing to integrate. But if Eve was not punished for disobedience, what was the true sin Logos attempted to kill within her? And how does that ancient fear still echo today as self-sabotage and the denial of your intuition, stealing your chance to reclaim Eve's command? The figure of the serpent is one of the most misunderstood archetypal symbols. Dogma branded it as evil, an external tempter. But in Jungian psychology, the serpent is not evil at all. It is instinct made flesh, chthonic wisdom rising from the earth, and most of all, it is Eve's own unconscious. It is the fragment of shadow that the innocent ego, trapped in Eden, refused to accept. The garden was a place of light, but without darkness, light has no meaning. The serpent whispered to Eve the most vital truth. You will not die. You will become as gods, knowing good and evil. What the serpent offered was direct knowing, gnosis. The Edenic world was a state of blind obedience to an external logos, to law. The serpent invited her to feel truth, to trust her intuition, her Eros, to embrace complexity instead of hiding behind rules. When Eve listened to the serpent, she did not fall into temptation. She was listening to her own shadow, calling her toward wholeness, toward the self. And what is the fruit of knowledge? Not sin, but the birth of conscious duality. Before the fruit, Eve lived in unconscious unity, with no moral choice, no capacity to discern. She was unfinished. The fruit symbolizes acceptance of duality, light and darkness, life and death, logos and eros. It marks Eve's integration of the shadow, the instinctive, sexual, curious, autonomous part of her that dogma condemned. For Eve to become an individual, she needed to break free from the collective persona of innocence and accept the responsibility of being whole. The fruit is the awakening of ego, the moment it separates from the collective unconscious and begins the path of individuation. Had Eve remained in Eden, she would have been beautiful, but stagnant, forever denied the self as a conscious choice. The act of eating the fruit was not disobedience, it was psychic audacity, the first conscious step toward totality. Many believe the price of sin was pain and suffering, but the price was never external punishment. It was the weight of consciousness itself. The true pain that followed was the awareness of separation from the collective unconscious, from nature, from innocence. The nakedness they felt was not physical shame, but the vulnerability of a newly awakened ego without the shield of illusion. The hardships that followed, toil, childbirth, effort, are metaphors for individuation. A purposeful life cannot unfold without conscious work, without embracing necessary pain. Eve chose evolution over the comfort of stagnation. The true sin, the true tragedy, was never what Eve did. It was how the collective shadow weaponized her act. What most people don't see is that the price of knowledge was not pain, but something far subtler. The rigid logos, unable to kill Eve's awakening, chose to kill her authority instead. The judgment and guilt cast upon Eve were not meant to punish her. They were engineered to stop her from becoming an autonomous spiritual authority. And that is the turning point. Logos ensured that Eve's ego would never return to innocence, but it did so through a far more insidious psychological defense. So what was this mechanism? It was introjected guilt, a guilt so deep that it becomes indistinguishable from identity. A guilt planted inside the psyche until the individual believes, my intuition is dangerous, my desire is wrong, my voice cannot be trusted. This is the archetypal lie, a lie crafted to fracture Eve from her own inner authority, to keep her forever doubting the very self she awakened. And this same lie still moves inside you today. It appears as self-sabotage, as paralysis, as the fear of speaking truth, even when your soul is burning for it. It whispers that your intuition is naive, that your instincts will lead you astray, that your longing is a threat to the order around you. But it is only a shadow, a projection centuries old, a lie designed to silence the part of you that is closest to the divine. The real question now is, how do you reclaim the inner authority that Logos tried to kill and restore the voice that was always meant to be yours? After the serpent's command, the act of eating the fruit could not be undone. Eve's ego had awakened. The knowledge of duality was irreversible. Through a Jungian lens, the expulsion from Eden is not the wrath of a furious God. It is the psychological necessity for consciousness to evolve. Eden was the protective unconscious womb. Being forced out is the soul's birth, the moment the ego must painfully separate from the collective unconscious to begin the individuation journey. The expulsion is, in truth, the process of retracting projection. In Eden, Adam and Eve projected their totality, their safety, onto God and the garden. Losing that environment forces the individual to internalize the source of security. Eden was the persona of innocence, a pleasant, simple mask, but stagnant. For the self, the wholeness, to emerge, that naive persona had to die. Their first feeling after the fruit was shame and nakedness. Nakedness is no moral riddle. It is the raw vulnerability of the newly awakened ego. Aware now of itself and of duality, it no longer has the defenses of innocence and obedience. The veil of unconsciousness has been lifted. For the first time, Eve feels the weight of being an individual separate from divine order and natural harmony. Shame arises as the primordial fear of judgment, the fear that individual consciousness might be deemed flawed by the rigid logos. Here is the birth of guilt. And society, the collective shadow, takes advantage of this fragile moment. Social fear brands Eve's act as shame and sin to ensure that, in the psyche of every future human, the pursuit of consciousness and the hunger for gnosis would be forever tied to guilt and pain. Here lies the true tragedy and the key to your liberation. The real burden Eve carried was never toil or physical pain. It was the archetypal psychological lie that seeking wholeness, the self, is inherently sinful. This lie is the dogma's defense mechanism. 1. Imposed guilt. Guilt keeps the individual docile, dependent on external hierarchy. If you feel guilty for being who you are, for your intuition, your desires, your Eros, you will never seek inner authority. 2. Paralysis of Eros. By calling curiosity and intuition sinful, society amputated the feminine side of the psyche in all human beings, men and women alike. Expelled from Eden, Eve is forced to carry this lie not as her truth, but as the archetypal burden of civilization. She becomes the eternal figure of the woman who dared to be whole and was condemned for it. Her pain is the pain of every soul forbidden to be complex and autonomous. Her inner battle now is the endless tension between the truth of herself, the command to seek wisdom, and the lie of her imposed persona, the sinner, the guilty one. Society stole from her the right to human complexity, reducing her soul to half. Yet in this extreme conflict lies the spark of Eve's individuation. The collective shadow struck so fiercely that it forced her inward. She had to find a truth immune to external judgment. Her exile stripped her of every illusion until she was compelled to internalize her totality. But if Eve's act was the beginning of her consciousness, why does humanity still feel so guilty for seeking its own truth? In her isolation, Eve needed an unshakable certainty. She needed to prove to herself that her gnosis, her intuitive knowing, was just as valid as law. For that, Eve had to confront the final fortress. She had to integrate the masculine principle. How did Eve's Animus emerge to validate her gnosis and make her worthy of the truth she received? And what is the first thing you must do for your Animus to free your Eros? Eve was cast out of Eden, carrying the awareness of duality, but also bearing a weight too heavy for any soul to hold: guilt. Not a feeling, but an archetypal burden, the burden of the repressed feminine. In Jungian psychology, guilt is not merely a moral error, it is a psychological tool. Society and dogma, the collective shadow, use guilt to keep the individual docile, obedient, and most of all, detached from inner authority. If you see yourself as inherently flawed, inherently sinful, you will never trust your intuition, your Eros. You will reach for external law, external approval, external logos. Guilt is the primary enemy of the self, the totality. It steals your permission to be whole. It forces you to renounce your shadow, your desire, your autonomy, just to be seen as pure, as acceptable to the structures of power. By branding Eve's act as a sin, the collective shadow successfully castrated the feminine principle inside every psyche. Eros, intuition, feeling, connection, creativity became synonymous with failure, with shame. Your intuition becomes hysteria. Your strength becomes aggression, if you carry the feminine signature. Your hunger for intuitive truth, for gnosis, becomes rebellion. This internalized guilt becomes self-sabotage. Even after leaving dogma, the judgment remains inside. The inner voice whispers, "Don't trust that feeling. You are not enough to lead. You don't deserve authority." And so the movement toward individuation freezes. Guilt blocks the emergence of totality. For Eve, the path to the self was not seeking forgiveness from outside. It was removing the collective shadow from within. She had to separate the truth of herself from the lie of her imposed persona. The self demands integration, light and shadow, innocence and guilt. But guilt, the archetypal lie, demands division. Denial of guilt is the first step in reclaiming the shadow's legacy. Strength is never found in repression, only in wholeness. By confronting this burden, Eve faced the agony of separation. She became the bearer of the suffering of all women and men who deny their intuitive nature just to belong. Yet surrendering to that pain is what ultimately leads her to power. Her forced isolation after the expulsion was not the end, it was the catalyst. Eve was pushed into the depths of her own unconscious to find a truth immune to outside judgment. And here emerges the most feared stage, the void of certainty. When the individual removes imposed guilt and questions external rule, the ground collapses. The safety of dogma disappears. The primordial terror arises. What if I'm wrong? What if my gnosis is hysteria, just as they said? This fear of the void is the dark night of the soul, the moment the ego must dissolve the last of its projections, painful but essential. Eve must prove that her faith rests in her own inner experience, not in any external father figure. Logos attempts to convince her that without proof, truth cannot exist. Eve's surrender to the void is not defeat. It is her victory, the triumph over the fear of not belonging. But this surrender requires an act of courage that can only come from the integration of the inner masculine. Eve needed a certainty no one could take from her. She needed to prove to herself that her gnosis was as valid as the law. So how did her Animus arise to validate her intuition and make her the first autonomous spiritual authority? Her Animus manifested as inner clarity, the masculine force that gives structure to intuition. It did not silence her Eros, it built a foundation for it. It transformed feeling into certainty. intuition into direction, gnosis into wisdom. And what is the first step for you to use your reason to validate your heart? You must let your animus witness your eros without trying to correct it. Reason must become the guardian of intuition, not its judge. The moment you allow your inner masculine to honor your inner feminine, to give form to your feeling instead of denying it, you begin the same sacred integration that once transformed Eve into a sovereign soul guided not by fear, but by her own inner truth. Eve had survived the exile from Eden and faced the weight of imposed guilt. She broke free from the need to be validated by the outer rule of logos, but freedom brought her to a different, more haunting landscape, the void of certainty. This was not the isolation born of judgment. It was the emptiness left behind when external safety vanishes. The ego, long accustomed to an outside authority, divine command, dogma, hierarchy, now stood alone in the center of the soul. Jung would say this is the moment when the ego must dissolve its final projections. In Eden, Eve risked projecting her own inner divinity, the self, onto an external god. Now the void forced her to reclaim it. She had to prove that her faith lived in her own inner experience, not in any figure outside her. Logos whispered its old threat, "Without proof, there is no truth." The void awakened the primordial fear, the fear of ultimate abandonment. Not just physical loss, but the terror of being abandoned by her own truth. For the inner Eve, the wounded child, this emptiness felt like the end. It was the ego's final trick, clinging to the comfort of an external source of power. Eve's final test was to face the shadow of absolute solitude, the acceptance that truth is often a path walked by very few. This is where most people turn back, returning to the comfort of obedience and dogma. But Eve had tasted knowledge. She refused to return. Her surrender to the void was not collapse, it was coronation. In yielding to it, she found fullness. She stopped seeking proof in the past and opened herself to the current of the future, the path her intuition, her anima, had been calling her toward. Fear dissolved into the knowing that her mission was not to convince, but to embody the truth that had transformed her. This transmutation of pain became the final act of her individuation. What the world called loneliness, Eve transformed into absolute authority. She had no temple, her body was the temple. She had no sermon, her life was the sermon. In crisis, she birthed totality. In silence, she found God within. A new command echoed in her soul. Let go of the old self, the self that depended on external authority to validate its faith. She became the source, the center, the feminine self in motion. She became the living proof that revelation is personal, intimate, immune to hierarchy. Eve became the legend her own unconscious required. She became her own authority. But to carry this message of totality into a world governed by the fear of logos, she needed a certainty that could not be shaken. The void pushed her to the edge, but the final trial still awaited. To prove that her intuition, her eros, was stronger than skeptical reason, logos. She had to confront the masculine principle, not only in the world, but in her own soul. So how did Eve's animus arise to validate her gnosis and turn intuition into a certainty carved from stone? Eve had surpassed the paralysis of guilt and crossed the terrifying landscape of the void of certainty. She had proven that the self does not reside in any external authority, but to carry the message of totality into a world that worships law and proof, logos, she needed an unshakable center, a source of authority no one could dispute. That power could only arise from the integration of the inner masculine. In Jungian terms, the Animus is the masculine dimension within the feminine psyche. Reason, discernment, direction, spiritual authority. By branding her hysterical, society didn't merely repress her anima, intuition, feeling. It also attempted to disqualify her animus, to insist that a woman could receive truth only through a male intermediary. Eve's challenge was immense. She had to validate her own intuitive knowledge, her gnosis, in the face of external logos. Many women in their search for autonomy clash directly with the masculine energy of the external world. But Eve discovered something deeper. True strength isn't found in opposition, but in absorption, integration, and inner balance. Her animus could not remain passive. It had to emerge, be transformed, be affirmed. The power she used to stand against dogma was not superficial rebellion. It was the masculine principle of her soul awakening. Eve did not seek Adam's approval. She sought her own. She needed her internal reason to confirm the truth her heart, her Eros, already knew. Her animus no longer served judgment. It served her soul, and so she examined her own experience with clarity and precision. The pursuit of knowledge had not brought death, it had brought consciousness. Exile was not an ending, it was the beginning of autonomy. Guilt was a social imposition, not an inner truth. Her animus grew strong enough to recognize that what had died was the Edenic innocence, but the archetype of the whole woman was eternal. By integrating masculine and feminine, animus and anima, Eve became the archetype of wholeness. She did not oppose the masculine, she absorbed and equalized it. This inner union was her proof. This was why she did not despair. Her power came from within and could not be touched by any dogma. Her totality made her the first messenger of individuation for the feminine principle. Her path revealed that the self is not a masculine privilege or a religious reward. It is a birthright earned through the courage to integrate shadow and animus into a unified being. Eve had proven her worth to herself, but the world still wanted her to return to guilt and submission. She now carried absolute authority, and that raised a dangerous question. Would integrating this power turn her into the very rigidity that once condemned her? Her mission shifted to prove that authority, animus, could coexist with compassion, anima, that strength is found in totality, in the marriage of heart and mind. But when she brought this truth into the world, the same world that had called her guilty, she faced something harsher than exile, the skepticism of others, the disbelief of those who demanded factual proof, the doubt of those still aligned with Logos. This final conflict pushed Eve to a radical threshold. She had to abandon the need to be believed. And in confronting the skepticism of others, she realized something seismic. The moment you depend on belief, you surrender yourself. Eve's revelation was simple, but utterly liberating. Truth does not require witnesses. A soul does not need an audience. A revelation is self-sustaining when it is lived, not argued. This insight ignited the act that transformed her into the archetype of the pilgrim, the woman who carries her truth alone, free from the world's validation. Her final act of radical self-acceptance was this. Eve stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending herself. She stopped negotiating her truth for the comfort of others. She chose to walk forward with her truth as her companion, not her argument. She became the traveler whose map is intuition and whose compass is inner certainty. She walked not to be understood, but to be whole. This was the moment she became the pilgrim of the self, the one who walks without needing permission, without needing approval, without needing witnesses, the one who belongs only to her own truth. Eve had integrated her animus, her inner authority, and welcomed her anima, her intuition. She had reached totality. But the world around her had not, and soon she learned that wholeness, para quem ainda vive dividido, parece ameaça. Adam, the first companions, and the generations that would come after, could not see what she had become. They saw only what they feared. The collective shadow that once called her sinful now reappeared as skepticism. The disbelief of minds still anchored in the tyranny of Logos, still hungry for proof, while Eve carried certainty. Her knowledge was not logical, it was lived, not factual, but experiential, not demonstrable, but embodied. And this, for those without inner authority, was intolerable. They called her emotional, visionary, excessive, mystical. New masks for the same old rejection of the sacred feminine. This separation was cruel, but essential. Eve realized her truth could never be validated by those still trying to earn permission from an external God. They weren't seeing her, they were projecting their fear of wholeness. And so she faced the decision that sealed her destiny. She abandoned the need to be believed. This was her moment of radical self-acceptance, the moment she accepted that her truth belonged only to her, and that the only authority she ever needed was the one she held within. Noli me tangere, do not cling to me. Though spoken centuries later to Madalena, its essence belonged to Eve first, a command not outward, but inward. Do not touch meant, do not cling to the old self that seeks external validation. Do not cling to the world that fears your fullness. Do not let the dying system shape the woman you have become. Do not shrink back into innocence or obedience. The wholeness is internal now. Let the last chain fall. This journey into solitude was not abandonment. It was preservation. By stepping away, she protected the purity of the truth she had birthed. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was freedom from dependence. She no longer had a hierarchy. She was her own spiritual authority. And thus Eve became the archetype of the pilgrim, the woman who carries sacred truth through the world with no need for approval. The world wanted her to carry the message of submission, but she carried the message of the union of opposites. She had embraced her shadow, boldness, integrated her animus, reason or authority, and honored her anima, intuition. The self, her totality, was the only true inheritance she brought out of the fall. Her mission became this: to carry the legacy of feeling, the wisdom that cannot be written in laws, only lived in the quiet depth of being. Eve became the living proof that a human being's greatest strength is the ability to remain whole in a world that demands they divide. But carrying this totality through a fragmented world required a final act of separation to protect the purity of her gnosis. She could not remain among those who feared her. She needed a land where the sacred feminine could breathe again, a soil untouched by the cold rule of Logos. And so she turned towards her legendary destination, the place whispered through myth and echoed through oceans. Eve walked toward the sea, not to escape, but to transform, to become myth, to become memory, to become the first wanderer of the feminine self. The sea, that ancient symbol of the Great Mother, the womb of all creation, the waters of the unconscious, was the only place vast enough to hold her truth without demanding she shrink. There, at the threshold between land and infinite water, Eve stepped into her final freedom. Her solitude became sanctuary. Her path became prayer. Her presence became legacy. She walked along the shoreline, carrying the wisdom of shadow and light, of masculine and feminine, of certainty and surrender. And her journey became the materialization of her ultimate liberation. Her final legacy to humanity was this: you are not meant to belong to the world. You are meant to belong to your soul. Eve wandered not to be found, but to remain whole, not to teach, but to embody, not to resist, but to live the truth that once exiled her. And in her pilgrimage by the sea, she became the archetypal ancestral mother of all who walk the path of shadow and light, the eternal reminder that wholeness is not granted, it is chosen, and chosen again every time you dare to walk alone.
Eve had reached totality. She had integrated her shadow, welcomed her anima, and affirmed her animus. But carrying that wholeness inside a world still fractured by the collective shadow was impossible. To preserve the purity of her gnosis, her direct knowing of the soul, she needed one final act of separation: the solitary journey. This journey, whispered in apocryphal legends, is the psychological epilogue of her myth. Eve does not leave out of fear, she leaves out of spiritual necessity. Her body and her message could not be absorbed by the rigid dogmatic structure of Adam's and Cain's world, the world governed by external law. She had to walk toward the land where the sacred feminine could still breathe, still bloom, still be honored. A land beyond the reach of Logos. Jung saw the solitary journey as the critical stage of individuation, the test of whether wholeness can stand alone. For Eve, this meant walking a path guided only by the intuition she had reclaimed. Her destiny carried her to the sea, the womb of creation. The sea is the collective unconscious, the ancient domain of the primordial feminine. Eve surrendered herself to the waters of her anima. She left behind the land-bound logic of Logos and let the tides of intuition be her guide. She carried no scrolls, no commandments, no hierarchies. She carried only the legacy of feeling, the wisdom that cannot be written, only lived. Her mission was not to convert nations, but to plant the seed of totality in a soil capable of receiving it. She became the bridge between the wisdom of her awakening and the chthonic energies of the earth, where the feminine principle was still sacred. By living as a pilgrim, Eve materialized integration. She used strength, her animus, to navigate the world, and intuition, her anima, to choose her path. Her solitary existence became a living prayer, the proof that healing is self-generated and immune to persecution. Her final legacy is not merely the search for self, it is the legacy of the shadow. By accepting her past, the audacious one, the sinner, and merging it with her future, the sage, the whole one, she taught us this: redemption is not the rejection of the dark, it is the integration of what the dark protects. Totality, the self, is found only when we recognize the divinity within our humanity, with all its flaws, all its radiance. Eve's solitary journey was never exile. It was the embodiment of her final freedom. She was the first to prove that true authority belongs to the one who dares to be whole, even when that path must be walked alone. She was totality, and her life was the message. Her legacy is not meant to be admired, it is meant to be lived. Her wholeness is the mirror asking you, what part of yourself did society force you to hide? Eve finished the great work. She gave us the legacy of the shadow and the return of the sacred feminine. Her wisdom condenses into one command: accept your shadow, not to be punished, but to reclaim the strength it guards. She gave us the key to totality, but a key only matters if you dare to turn it. Eve proved that the highest authority belongs to the one courageous enough to be fully human, to unite reason with heart, clarity with instinct, animus with anima. So what did Eve do with her totality in her solitary journey? She lived it freely, silently, devoutly. And the deeper question remains: what will you do with the truth she left behind? For Eve's journey ends where every true journey begins: inside us.
Eve had completed the deepest of all transformations, the journey of individuation. She gave us the key to totality. Her audacity in Eden was never a fall. It was the ignition of her final freedom. She taught us that the greatest danger is not the world's judgment, the collective shadow, but the judgment we direct inward, the denial of our own Eros, our own feeling, our own intuition. Her legacy stands as living proof of the need to reclaim the sacred feminine, Eros, in a world still dominated by the rigidity of Logos. Where Logos insists on hierarchy and separation, Eve's Eros insists on connection and wholeness. At the heart of her legacy is permission. Permission for feminine intuition to be seen as spiritual authority. Permission for knowledge to be felt, gnosis, and not only reasoned. Permission for women and for the anima within men to be whole without needing external validation. Eve became the proof that strength does not come from repressing emotion, as the collective shadow demanded, but from weaving feeling into wisdom. She proved that a woman who accepts her vulnerability is in truth the strongest, because she does not fear the totality of her human experience. Eve's legacy is not of the past. It is here, in our present struggle. Her story mirrors how fiercely our own society still tries to fragment us, how often we are called too emotional, too intense, too visionary, when we are simply expressing our sacred feminine. Eve's call is for all of us, women and men alike, to reclaim the anima and the eros that were exiled, to trust intuition in the face of logic's pressure, and to value feeling as a legitimate form of wisdom. Her legacy is this: the most radical act of faith is believing in yourself. Eve's wisdom condenses into a psychological command. Accept your shadow, not to be punished, but to integrate the strength it carries. Your tears, your rage, your vulnerability. These are the language of the soul. Strength lives in wholeness. Eve proved that true authority belongs to the one brave enough to be human, to unite reason with heart. She is the proof that the final cure is spiritual autonomy. You are your own authority. You are your own proof. And so Eve's journey ends exactly where every true journey begins, inside us. She handed us the key, not a golden key, but a key of radical acceptance. If Eve's story touched the shadow you carry, if you feel the call to reclaim your voice and your inner totality, then your soul work, your shadow work, must begin now. Subscribe to Shadow Work Stories and activate the bell so you don't miss the next archetypal journey. This channel is not just about stories, it's about turning pain into wisdom and silence into voice. Leave your like if you believe in the power of totality, and click the video appearing now on your screen to continue diving into the journey of the self. Remember, your self is waiting. Wholeness is your destiny.